I want to point at the fact that there are Orthodox people who think what it means to express Orthodoxy in the North American context is not to do Orthodoxy in a North American way. We
Right.
can't do Orthodoxy in a North America. We have to be like the churches in the old country. And this could be done tacitly, it could be done quietly. Oh, we're gonna spend a whole bunch of money and build a brand new church. And guess what? It's gonna look like a church that could be plopped in the middle of Rostov in Russia.
Hey, welcome everyone to the Orthodox Christian podcast. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Father Yuri Hladio. There is a former discussion where we go over Father Yuri's spiritual autobiography, but today we are looking at the topic of Western Orthodoxy, or how to embody the Orthodox tradition in a Western way that makes sense to people on one hand, but isn't giving in to just the modes and methods of communication of the present era. So we're not talking about having theater seats and a rock band up on stage, but we're also not talking about just copy and pasting exactly what a parish may look like in Moscow or something of that nature. We want to be able to communicate effectively with people that are English speakers raised in North America while faithfully preserving the tradition of Orthodoxy. So without further ado, Father Yuri, why don't you take us away and tell us what's been on your mind lately?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Max. It's always a joy to talk to you. The question that I've been wrestling with in my parish life. So I'm the rector or priest in charge of St. Maria of Paris Orthodox Church in Hamilton, Ontario, and we were born May 2020, like in the pandemic, right? So a lot of the ways when the world was starting to come out of its shell out of the pandemic, that's actually when we were starting to like get a building and start doing services. So we immediately had to figure out how to. We were all North American people, but how do we express our orthodoxy that makes sense in that North American mind? The phrase that I told you that I was thinking about was um, how to be Orthodox in a North American way. And then uh, and then you asked a clarifying question, like, do you mean how to be Orthodox in a North American context? I was like, no, not that, right? It's not about being Orthodox. What I'm the wrestling with is not the concept of being Orthodox in a North American context per se. It's about being Orthodox in a way that is genuinely expressive of the culture that we exist in North America while remaining faithful to the tradition that we received. And there's a lot of tension there. There's a lot of you really do need to have a deep understanding of the tradition, right? Because what we're being asked is, it's similar to what there's that story that Jesus gives, the parable that Jesus gives, where he gives these three different servants of his different amounts of money, and he asks them, "Okay, take care of this. I'm going to go away." And he comes back, and two of them risked it, right? They
Mm.
invested. They brought in a bigger return on their investment, whereas the third one simply buried the thing he had and then gave it back to the master unchanged, right? And actually it's that person who is condemned in the end. And I think that the tendency for us Orthodox is to think that our job as Orthodox is to bury our talent, is to bury Orthodoxy in a hermetically sealed chamber, and just simply to pass it on to the next generation, um, hermetically sealed. Whereas indeed there is a sense in which the tradition has to be inherited, and we have to pass on this tradition, but we have to express it within our culture. So there's that tension of the unchanging nature of the church, or the tradition of the church, right? The wisdom of the fathers and the mothers of the church that we have to hold on to for dear life, but at the same time, we have to move forward in time, right? I sometimes tell people, and it could sound a little shocking, I'm not interested in being the ancient church. And what I'm trying to say is I'm not interested in doing, let's say, liturgical archaeology, or like, well, they did this back then, or there's this individual practice, let's start doing this. It's kind of an innovative thing, even though it's something that people did a long time ago here. For me, it's about taking what can we do to take what's already present within the tradition and turn up the volume on certain things that make sense to North American people, and turn down the volume on other things that don't make sense to certain North American people. I can keep talking, but if you want to jump in at all, you can. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, okay. So, regarding tradition, it might be helpful to define what that is and then maybe explore what aspects are malleable and then which aspects don't change because they cannot change because they're about God who is eternal and the same from age to age. And then also maybe to talk about what aspects of Orthodoxy we're amplifying or seeking to amplify, and which aspects you might be wanting to decrease in volume. Because I think some people might hear that and some alarm bells might go off and say, like, well, what are you going to start doing? Because there's lots of churches that try to adapt to the culture and wind up onboarding, for lack of a better word, a lot of woke nonsense that doesn't actually do the gospel any good and makes the church fruitless in the next generation because people see that it's a farce. So I don't think that we're talking about that, but it's probably helpful to define it. So let me just give a shot at defining tradition. I was talking to Dr. Hladio about this recently in a former episode, but there's like different parts of tradition that we could talk about, but I think maybe the spirit of tradition is the important thing to emphasize insofar as tradition. This is one way to talk about it, and you can let me know if you think it's accurate, but tradition is our connection with Christ, and that there is a way of life that is given to us within Orthodoxy that is what tradition is about. And so it is about fasting, it is about prayer, it is about tithing to the community, it is about going to church and worshiping God. But essentially, all these things are about Christ and how he reveals himself to us and connects with us. And our response as the community is worship to God. And then there's different things within that tradition, like scripture, like the liturgy, like the church fathers, like the architecture of the church and the iconography, that are all supports to the worship that enable it to happen. And so I think maybe one way to talk about this in terms of embodying Orthodoxy in a North American way is to say, how do we incorporate all these different supports of Orthodoxy or of the tradition so that worship can actually take place? And so an easy example of this would be the adoption or use of English in the liturgy, because most people in our North American setting speak in English. And so if you use English, it supports the worship now. It allows it to exist. And I think the same thing might be true with the other portions or aspects of Orthodox tradition.
Yeah, one of the things that always comes to mind when I think about, because yeah, it is true, we're not trying to adapt, to the culture or things like that, but we are trying to express within the culture. And one of the guiding principles for me, and what I really think that liturgy has to be, is invisible, right? The various different aspects of liturgy, whether it's icons or the music or the language or the vestments or the incense or the moving, ultimately, of course, they're not going to be invisible when you first come to church. When you first come to church, that's all you're going to see. Like, all you're going to see is icons and incense, and like you're going to fixate on those things, right? Because it's a new experience to you and everything like that. However, for those who regularly participate for decades and decades, ultimately, all those aspects of worship should be so just ingrained into your psyche and into your heart that they become invisible. And it's when a great example is like English, right? If you were to use Anglo-Saxon, I don't know, Middle English or something like that in your service, if you were to use Portuguese in your service in British Columbia, Canada, in a non-Portuguese speaking community, that choice that you've made is drawing attention to something that should not be drawing attention to itself. So what are the things that we can do? This is sort of a guiding principle, right? Okay, if we're going to make a change or if we're going to make an adjustment, one thing that I think about is, does this make that aspect of liturgy more visible or less, or more invisible, right? So another example with language is kind of an easy one for us to pick up on. I think we get it intuitively. One also, I think, is music. What kind of music are we choosing to sing our words to? That's one. And there's a lot of efforts in North America now to have music which connects with our Western ear, right? So that's another example. But that's one of that's one of the ways that I think about it. That gives me guardrails, right? Because I think sometimes one of the issues with adapting to the culture is there are no guardrails, and it's just the whims of the person who's, I think the kind of vestment color would be nice, so you kind of do it, right? But I think having that guardrail of, am I doing this so that more attention can be drawn, or it could draw more attention, or am I doing this because it makes it easier to forget about it and to just pray?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it makes me think of, I don't think it's Bulgakov. I think it's the other sort of big modern theological giant of Orthodox theology, who I'm not remembering his name currently. Maybe you can help me out. But he's known as saying that we cannot embody I don't know, this is a paraphrase, but something like, we cannot embody the church fathers by imitation, by wooden imitation. And so that we have to actually adopt the methodology that they used and carry that forward. And that's the way that we're continuous with the early church. And so I think that it's less about just copy and pasting and more about having the actual spirit of the fathers and carrying that on. And maybe an example to make that a little more concrete is just how we engage with scripture. So the church fathers interpreted scripture allegorically, and so they saw it in a symbolic fashion, and they saw it as a way to speak about our relationship with God, the nature of the soul in relation to God, and basically a deeper level, and how the Old Testament scriptures also were a revelation in a hidden way of Jesus Christ, and that he is contained there in the different stories. And so there's one way to go about interacting with the church fathers where you just copy and paste literally what they said about each thing, and you treat it as if the church fathers have an exhaustive list of the interpretations of scripture. And if they don't say that specific thing, then it's out of bounds for us. But there's another way to engage with it where you say, well, the church fathers actually gave us a way to see the world that is sacramental, that connects it with God. You see the physical things connected with the spiritual realities. And this is connected with Christ, who is fully God and fully man. But then how we interpret scripture, so long as it's within the bounds of Orthodox dogma and tradition, so long as it leads us to a greater love of the Trinity and of Jesus Christ, then it's acceptable. Whereas if it falls outside of that, it doesn't matter how great our copy and pasting of other things may have been, it's misguided. So I think the end is really important, and perhaps the end is really important with the icons and with the architecture and the style of music, that we have a certain freedom to adapt to these different cultures. And we should probably give some examples of this historically, that this has been going on, and it's not like this is a new thing, that this has always been the case. But the important part is that we connect people, or that we are being connected with Jesus Christ.
Well, I think Jesus Christ is a great example of this dynamic, right? I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, right? Like, he lived in a time that had, well, we're like, Jesus was criticized for being an innovator, for bringing something new, for bringing something that's not in line with the story of Israel. But Jesus he never says, you're right, I am innovating, or I am doing something new. I'm doing something completely different. He doesn't say that. He says, I am renewing, but I'm in line with the tradition, right? This does look different, doesn't it? But actually, if you think about it, the deeper wisdom that lies underneath the holy texts of Israel and the story of this nation, I'm in line with that wisdom, and indeed I am that wisdom. That's his point there. And I think we inherit the temptation that the first century Israelites had, which is to say, we're just going to fall back on our tradition and bury our talent in the ground, right? And that's perhaps why Jesus used that parable when he taught the crowds. So we have that temptation as well. We share that temptation with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, to bury and just say hermetically seal that thing. Whereas Christ gives us an example of how do you appropriately and in line with the wisdom underneath these texts and these traditions to renew them. And so I think it's incumbent on us to argue with each other, right? It's up to us to risk it, in a sense, right? And always be striving to be in line with the wisdom, which is Christ himself. But I think Christ is the great example of that. So yes. Hopefully he can be with us in this discussion.
Yes. Well, and I think just to give a little more definition to the discussion, probably the thing that you're concerned about, and you can fill us in on this as well, is Orthodox communities just becoming inward focused, so that they become cultural enclaves that are about preserving Ukrainian identity or Antiochian identity or Greek identity, and they lose the sense that the church is meant to be an extension of the kingdom of God that is expanding throughout the whole world, and that the purpose of the church, one of the key aspects of the church, is to be on mission. And Christ called us to go into the world and to proclaim the gospel to all creation, and that it's not enough for us just to worship God accurately in the sense of using the proper words and the formal liturgy and icons and had to have everything right, but to not be concerned about connecting with people and actually including them in that, because Christ became a man that man might become divine. And so if we aren't sharing this divine life and going out to spread the divine life with humanity so that they can be incorporated in God, then it's not helpful and it's not adequate or fulfilling the command that Christ has given his church. I think that's sort of the drive that you're
Yeah,
aiming
and
at.
I want to take it one step further. I hope I don't get in trouble, but I want to take it one step further, which is to say, you were mentioning that kind of Orthodoxy has the temptation to become these almost, or the thing that I'm fighting against is maybe the temptation for Orthodoxy to become like a cultural enclave, right? That it's about being Ukrainian or Greek. Frankly, I think that there are churches that are becoming Orthodox enclaves, right? That Orthodoxy itself is becoming the idol. It's the, to put it tritely, or to use a cliche, it becomes the us versus them mentality of Orthodoxy, or that, something like it's about being Orthodox, right? It's about being Orthodox, capital O, Orthodox, as opposed to remaining faithful to the tradition we've received, right? And there's tremendous amount of nuance in that point, because I'm not criticizing Orthodoxy. I'm not criticizing the traditions of the church or what we've received, but I want to point at the fact that there are Orthodox people who think what it means to express Orthodoxy in the North American context is not to do Orthodoxy in a North American way.
Right.
We can't do Orthodoxy in North America. We have to be like the churches in the old country, and this could be done tacitly. It could be done quietly. Oh, we're gonna spend a whole bunch of money and build a brand new church, and guess what? It's gonna look like a church that could be plopped in the middle of Rostov in Russia. Why? This is an English-speaking community, and why are we doing that, right? Why are we using certain kinds of musical traditions or certain kinds of translations of the English? And again, these are nuanced points, because it's not that any of these individual things is wrong, but we have to be very cognizant of the aesthetic choices that we're making and what we're saying about the culture that we're in, or the culture that Orthodoxy can be expressed with. Yeah, I got more to say, but maybe I'll turn it over to you again.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of the early church with the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, because that was something that had to be navigated, where you have these people that are being included in the people of Israel, in the new Israel, who are Gentiles that don't have the same lineage, but are nevertheless part of the church, and then what that meant in terms of what practices to adopt or not to adopt was something that had to be worked out. And the contentious issue that's mentioned a lot in the New Testament is the practice of circumcision, which was the sign of the covenant for the Jewish people that continued, but the sign of baptism became much more significant as the marker of inclusion in God's people. And there are certain Gentiles that are actually circumcised in Scripture, like I think Paul has one of his associates circumcised for the sake of getting along with the Jews, but nevertheless also writes to the Galatians and says, you shouldn't be circumcised, because essentially it didn't work to renew people's hearts. It was meant to be a outward symbol of an inward reality that people, you can think of it almost like a wedding ring, like people were meant to be married to God, and they strayed from that at various times. But the point wasn't just to be outwardly marked. It was to be set aside internally, to have one's heart circumcised, which is a really strange way to talk. But if you want to sort of translate it to our day, it's like you should have the wedding ring on your heart as well. You shouldn't just have it on your finger as this external thing and then go doing whatever you want with these other women. But, oh, I've got this wedding ring on my hand. It's about actually internalizing that. And so it feels like with Orthodoxy, there is a similar dynamic where you have a lot of people that are converting to Orthodoxy in North America. And then I think there is at times a temptation to feel like one needs to become Russian or Greek or Ukrainian and adopt this different culture to become truly Orthodox. And sometimes there's even a sense that, well, if you weren't born and raised in the Orthodox Church, you aren't a real legitimate Orthodox Christians. Like, those are the real Orthodox Christians, and we just happen to be included. And you want to be careful, because there is a lot of beauty that can be passed down, and there's something good about being raised in an environment where people are oriented towards that and have a certain appreciation for God. But I think it's also important to bear in mind what Tertullian said, where Christians aren't born, they're made. And so from another perspective, actually everyone is a convert, and everyone has to put their faith in Christ. And so there isn't like these two tiers of true Orthodox and false Orthodox. It's, if you've been baptized, if you're a member in good standing, if you're praying, if you're fasting, if you're tithing, if you're going to church regularly, you are, and receiving the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ, like, you are an Orthodox Christian, as far as I know. So there aren't these different levels, but I feel like part of the reason why I'm mentioning this is part of the reason why there is maybe a woodenness to the embodiment of the Orthodox tradition is potentially coming from the convert side. I don't know about like the cradle side, and maybe you can speak more about that because that's how you were raised. But I think there is a temptation for converts to think that the real Orthodox are the ones that are of a different nationality. Therefore, for me to be Orthodox, I need to adopt the methods of communication that work well with that nationality.
Yeah, I think that you need to have, if you're ever going to make any adjustments or anything like that, you need to have a deep understanding and appreciation and love for the inherited culture, right? So I'll give you an example. I'll give you a non-church example, right? So I worked at Starbucks for a long time, and one of the mottos, if a new manager came in, new managers were always told, don't move the mocha. And the mocha is like wherever the mocha pump happens to be, because the manager inevitably is going to come in and think things are kind of stupid in the arrangement, and they're going to change things up, right? And the motto was don't move the mocha, because you have to work there long enough to understand why it's there and to fall in love with why it's there, right? So you have to love why it's there, and you have to understand. And then from there, in the Starbucks mind, you can like make your adjustments. But I think perhaps that's why maybe it's well, I don't know about that. So, okay, here's an example. Here's something I think about. Why doesn't let's say the Orthodox, there's Russia, Ukraine, whatever, the Slavic style Orthodox churches, why don't they use Byzantine chant? And the answer being, well, because they express their Orthodoxy in a Slavic way, which includes Slavic words, Slavic music, Slavic vestments, Slavic haircuts, like that's why. So whatever happened there, whatever happened with the Orthodox, like with the Orthodoxy being brought to the lands of Kiev and Rus, that is what should happen when Orthodoxy goes into other cultures, right? And guess what? The Slavic people were the people who got to have a degree of self-determination when it came to how they will express their Orthodoxy. And that's why we have Slavic melodies in many of our churches, right? At our church, we use mostly music that comes from the traditions from Slavic countries like Ukraine and Russia. And I think that one of the issues is because Orthodoxy came to North America through immigration and things like that, we have a lot of these, they were involved with their cultural groups and they were held together by their cultural groups, which is fine. Like, you can imagine if I was kicked out of my country because of a war and I had to, go somewhere in Africa, and I found that actually a lot of us Canadians got shipped to the same city. It's like, well, I would love it if we could gather together and worship in our language, right? Like that. So I'm not begrudging anybody that. But over time, it can get a little wooden, and you can start thinking that the language and the cultural expression is an essential aspect of the tradition, and so I can understand why people might associate an onion dome with Orthodoxy, right? Though I don't think that association should be made that readily, right? If you're going to build a new church, maybe don't use an onion dome in North America. unless you are explicitly a Russian or Ukrainian church. So, and then also Orthodoxy tends to attract people who have the attitude of older is always better, right? Orthodoxy definitely has that attitude. We don't want to innovate. Like, you want to make sure you're in line with the tradition. So I think just temperamentally, on the grand scheme of things, Orthodoxy can tend to, and right now, Orthodoxy in North America doesn't have a long heritage. We're maybe a couple hundred years, maybe, right? So if you do go further back, you have to go back to the Russian church, the Ukrainian church, the Greek church, the Egyptian church, the churches from the Middle East. Like, you have to, that's where kind of your mind and imagination have to go to kind of enculturate, right? But now, sorry, maybe that's a good place to put a seam in the conversation there, but.
Yeah. Well, and I think that part of this is going to depend on whether people are in America or in Canada, because in Canada, it is a different mode or method of cultural engagement. And so it is more of a mosaic. That's sort of the classic image that's given, where people retain much more of their cultural identity first, and then they're Canadian. So they'd be like an Arabic Canadian or Ukrainian Canadian. Whereas in America, it's actually the opposite. And it is traditionally more of a melting pot, where people are first American and then their whatever national identity. And so I think that in terms of Orthodoxy, this does come into play, because from what I've heard about people that have experienced the American side of things and the Canadian side, and for people watching or listening, we're both Canadian, but the American church, I think, is a little more comfortable with adopting more American, quote unquote, ways of doing things. Maybe not all the time, but in Canada, it is more of an issue where communities can be just sealed off and more focused on maintaining their cultural identity. So that is one thing to consider. And then we don't necessarily need to talk about this right away, but in terms of engaging with the North American way of doing things, I'd be curious to hear like what your recommendations would be, but also how this can take place, because it's not as if someone that's a layperson can immediately affect things. And you do want it to be connected with the actual hierarchy of the church. You don't want people just going off and doing whatever they want, but at the same time, it seems like it should be an organic process where there's stuff coming up from the bottom, sort of bubbling up, as well as people saying things from on high, as it were. And to give a positive example of this, I'm part of the Antiochian Archdiocese, and within our Archdiocese, we are developing North American music, essentially. And I know the guy that's putting it together. He goes to the same parish as me, and it's extremely beautiful. And it's really fitting, because within the Antiochian Archdiocese, the standard music is more Byzantine, but to a Western ear, it sounds very, very Arabic and Middle Eastern, because that's the area that it's coming from. And so you have people chanting the E-song, which is this low drone that kind of goes throughout, and then you have someone doing more of like a complex melody over the top of it, which can be kind of hard to catch on to, because it is just so different. And it's actually, I think, patterned on the Byzantine or like Arabic language, and it fits really well with that because it emerged from it. Whereas English has a different way of sounding, and so there is different musical considerations that need to come into play, and that's recognized by the Antiochian Archdiocese. And so they are developing a whole set of new music for the Divine Liturgy, so that it can be connecting with people in a North American setting. So again, I just want to preface some of this just in case people are really nervous listening. It's like, on one hand, just consider like the wider Orthodox world, and note that, matter of factly, there are different traditions that embody the different cultures that they're inhabiting. So that's already a thing. It's not like Father Yuri and I are talking about doing something different in that regard. And then also note the work that's already been going on in North America, namely translating things into English, also having these different musical styles that are really fitting for a North American setting. But how do you see this change kind of taking place, Father Yuri? Like, if someone's a layperson, or if someone's a bishop, like what is the process by which this happens, if you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I'll give you an example from my parish, right? So this is an example of the people vote with their presence, right?
Yes.
So one of the main, so in the according to the Typicon, right? So the Typicon is like the rule book of the church, right? If you're going to do services, how are you going to do them, right? And it gives you a list of like, okay, you have the major feasts and the minor feasts, and it gives you these sort of ranks of how important that particular calendar date's feast days are, right? Most days are just kind of regular days with like a regular saint, right? But some saints get, they don't get just the regular liturgical expression. They get like a higher, almost to like the point of like a minor feast sort of celebration, and that would be things like Saint Nicholas, right? So Saint Nicholas, the way that you express his feast day liturgically is at a higher solemnity or a higher level of worship, right? And because naturally it's a saint that people love. That's why, right? If you love the saint, you do a more special service and you go to church, right? I'm sure if people have been involved in Orthodox Church for a long time, they'll be familiar that the feast day of St. Nicholas is December 6th, and most churches will have some kind of a service for that, for in honor of him. So the feast of St. Demetrius. So St. Demetrius was a martyr who died in Thessalonica during the Roman Empire, and he's a profoundly important saint to the Orthodox world. And he lived in Thessalonica. He died there, and he's buried there to this day. You can go to the church, and his tomb is there. And so his feast day is called for as one of the highest solemnities you can for a saint, right? So one of the first years here at St. Maria, after everything had opened up, I was organizing services, and I go, well, the Typicon, it calls for that you do St. Demetrius. So I did St. Demetrius, and we had other feast days where people would come and everything like that. Almost no one showed up for St. Demetrius, and that kind of took me aback. Whereas we would have people show up for other saints, and people showed up for the saints that were important for them, right? Whether it was like St. Luke the Evangelist, we did a service for him, and we have a scholar of the Gospel of Luke in our community, and we were doing a Bible study about the Gospel of Luke. So all these people came because they wanted to celebrate Luke the Evangelist. We have people who absolutely love St. Hilda of Whitby, right? A nun who lived in England in the 600s. Like, we have people who love her, have icons of her and stuff like that. If I did a service for Hilda of Whitby, according to the Typicon that we've inherited, it would be a very minor, you probably wouldn't even include her in hymnography. But in our community, that's really one of the things I could probably turn the volume up on, is like, okay, well, let's take that feast and make it into one of those greater saint days, right? Oh, and maybe let's turn down the volume on St. Demetrius. And like, I don't know if this sounds radical or anything, but you're not removing or getting rid of anything or adding anything to the tradition. You're just simply turning down the volume on certain things that aren't affecting or touching people, and turning up the volumes on the things that they care about. So that, I think it was an example in my parish of people voted with their feet, right? It's like, oh, this saint, he is an important saint to the history of Orthodoxy. He's an important saint to the people of Thessalonica and to the people of Greece. He hasn't connected to the hearts of the people in Hamilton, but somebody like St. Hilda of Whitby or St. Patrick of Ireland, right? Those people get, right? And they would come out to celebrate the memory of that saint. So that's, I guess, kind of one example of maybe what's one thing you can do if you're a parishioner, right? Is express a desire. Could we do a service for this particular saint that I love, right? And just expressing that, and of course always being obedient to your priest and to your bishop and all that. But there's nothing wrong with expressing a desire. Yeah, that's maybe this. I think that's a good example from my parish life there. Not sure if that answers your question there, but
yeah. Well, okay. So you're talking basically about, from the bottom up perspective, people in a parish may attend a certain feast more frequently than another, and that shows what is connecting with them. And so it's like you're allowing people to engage with saints. So it's all good. You're connecting with an Orthodox saint. It's just that people have different preferences for which saint they may connect with.
And that's absolutely normal. Like, that's
Yes.
normal and absolutely like run-of-the-mill boring Orthodoxy, is that there are saints that are more important in certain geographical areas, and that certain geographical areas would accentuate the feast days of the saints that they love and downplay the feast days of the saints that they don't really care that much about or don't connect with. So like it's this dynamic is kind of run-of-the-mill boring orthodoxy. That's just how it's always been.
Yes, yes, yes. And I was going to mention that I know Martin Mass has been another liturgy that has been popular at some Orthodox parishes, which, as far as I know, is more of like a Western tradition. But it's where you gather at a parish and you have these little lanterns that the kids will make, and then you march around the community, and it can be a great way for the actual community to see the Orthodox Church in action and to sometimes even participate in that procession. I've heard of that happening at some parishes in British Columbia, at least. So, what about the style of icons? I know that that was something that you wanted to talk about. So, in what sense is there continuity with what's gone on before and being handed down? But how can it be connecting with the North American sensibility or way of seeing things? Maybe just talk about like different styles of icons and how those have even been adapted to different cultures historically. Father Yuri.
Yeah, one thing to note is that there's no canonical style for icons. We're going to talk about style. Sorry, I gotta get my hands on the camera. Style. Like there's no canons about style, right? There's certain canons like you cannot portray Jesus Christ as a lamb. That's one of the canons. There's a local canon that says you can't portray God the Father as an old man, right? That's another canon. So I think there's literally only one more canon that explicitly talks about iconography in terms of the canons of the church. So there's not many canons of the church. Now there are received traditions about how you paint and everything like that. So I don't want to get into the discussion of like what makes an icon versus not an icon or anything like that. However, I think similar to my example with the Demetrius feast day versus the Hilda feast day, I think that there are certain styles and certain things about an icon that connect with people in our culture and certain things that don't. And I think if you are, let's say, a parish that's going to look into commissioning an icon or several icons, iconographers will draw sketches for you, and then you can adjust them as you want. It's like, oh, actually, like I would like the quote to be this in the book, or could she really hold a scroll instead of a book, right? You can make those kinds of adjustments, and to get your community's input, right? Or if let's say you're gonna commission an icon of the Mother of God and of Christ, what if you asked your community to send an icon of Christ, find one on the internet that you think looks nice, send it to me. And then it's just through like the natural organic process of learning what aesthetic people in your community are connecting with, and just having your icons commissioned in that kind of a way, instead of trying to force fit 15th century Russian iconography into your different cultural context. So I think a lot of it's just or perhaps you're a parishioner at a church, right? And you would like to commission an icon for your parish. So you look online, you find an iconographer you like, right? And you go, oh, I really like this style. I really like the way this feels. And you get a screenshot and you send it to your priest. Say, Father, I'm thinking about commissioning an icon of St. Hilda of Whitby, who I have a special connection with. This is an iconographer that I really like. Here's an icon of another female monastic saint that he has done. With your blessing, would it be okay if I commissioned this icon for the church? There you go. That's as simple as it gets. So yeah, just being open to being not open, being attuned to the things that do connect with people, and just not force feeding a particular style down people's throats.
Yeah. And it's not as if you're talking about just like doing some, again, radically innovative. Like I think people, when they hear about like adapting or connecting with the North American setting, they might think we're talking about doing some sort of abstract painting in the liturgy, right, instead of something that's actually right, appropriate.
But that's why you connect. You connect with your hierarchy. You say, and you get the hierarchy on your side, right? Like you don't do it as an antagonistic. You say, here's an iconographer I like. Here's an image of a female monastic saint that this iconographer has done. I would love to be able to commission an icon of St. Hilda of Whitby, who's important to me and my family. is this something that you might consider blessing? And he might say, no, right? And you have to be open to that, right? You have to be obedient, right? And maybe it's something that you hang as something important to your family in your own home, and just does not quite have a place in the communal worshiping life of the church. But we have that freedom as well. So yeah, connecting with your hierarchy, and it's not just you deciding, right? It's you deciding in community, right? And that the presbyter of your community being, the priest of your community being kind of the synecdoche, the one who represents the whole of the community, right? At least in the parish context. Yeah.
Yes. And it also sounds like there are certain styles of iconography that have been handed down, and just top of mind, there is sort of the Byzantine style. There's more that sort of almost modern Russian style where it's more influenced by the Enlightenment, and they kind of look like Catholic icons sometimes. They're more realistic, that you do see in parishes sometimes. And then there's also the Coptic Orthodox style, which is somewhat more cartoonish, for lack of a better word, but it's definitely different in its dimensions and a little less realistic than some of the others.
And none of those styles are canonical. And why do those styles exist? Because people within that culture adapted iconography to fit to in their culture. So that when you are an Egyptian Orthodox Christian, you're a Coptic Orthodox Christian, you walk into a church, the images make sense to you, right? Why is there a Russian style of iconography or a Ukrainian style or a Greek style? It's because those cultures have already gone through this process. So I think all I'm trying to point to is that now in North America, Orthodoxy is starting to really ingrain itself here, or North Americans are becoming Orthodox, right? And that North America has a tremendous amount of cradle-born Orthodox Christians now as North Americans. And all I think we are trying to do as a church, or all that this process is trying to do, is exactly what all Orthodox Christians have done in any culture. So I'm not trying to teach anything new or trying to bring in new traditions of iconography or anything like that. However, I do want to point at the fact that there is no canonical style for icons, and we have to be willing. I mean, I hope I don't sound too radical here, but we have to be willing to risk it in that sense. We have to be willing to trial and error. We will make mistakes, right? There will be things that Orthodox Christians create, whether it's music, icons, architecture. We will create in North America, and it won't be that great. Like that's going to happen, right? Time will remove those things. Those will slough off of the tradition. But the things that are genuine, right? That icon of Saint Hilda or whatever it might be, those will last. And we have to have a degree of willingness to risk it and to not bury our talent, right, in the ground, and just say, well, Russian Orthodox iconography is good enough for us North Americans.
Yes. Well, and it makes me think even of the icons at the parish that I go to, where they're quite vibrant, and the faces of the different figures are not too dour and grumpy. They're a little more neutral and even happy sometimes. And so it makes me think that there are these slight variations that you can get within iconography to fit the parish. And I know that the choir director at our parish recently went to a different parish, and she really noted how the icons, they were beautiful, but they weren't her icons. They weren't the ones that she connected with and was used to worshiping and using as aids to worship. So I think that's definitely the case.
Yeah. That's one thing that I sometimes, when I have this conversation with people, I say, when people come to St. Maria's, I want them to experience two things. And I'm talking about a person who's never even been in a church before, right? Just like, by the way, I've been having a lot of people come to the church who've never been to church before, let alone, like, not coming from a Protestant background or anything. It's just, I've never been to church, which is like, that's outside of my wheelhouse. I'm usually used to dealing with Christians who are coming to Orthodoxy to get kind of a more full expression of the gospel. But now I got distracted.
Well, I mean, if someone's coming in fresh.
The two things. Yeah, the two things. So one, they're coming in fresh. I want them to feel, number one, I don't really know what's going on, right? Like I don't know what's going on. The worship here is not something that we're trying to make relevant, right? In that sort of trite way. It's not quote unquote seeker friendly in that sense. So it's, you genuinely don't know what's going on. There's a guy in a dress walking around swinging smoke and whatever. Like, it looks weird. I don't even know what they're praying, whatever. But number two, what I want them to feel and experience is, but these are my people, right? This is of me. These people represent me. Even if I wouldn't go to church here, I know that there are me kind of people that are doing this. And that's what I want people to experience when they first come, right? It's like, I don't know what's going on, but I know these people, right? They're Hamiltonians. They're my neighbors. They're the person that I buy groceries, and they're the clerk that's at the stand or whatever. Because I don't know if other people have had this experience. I don't know if you've had this experience, Max. I've been in churches, Orthodox churches, and I have the experience of, I know what's going on. I know exactly what's going on, and these are not my people. And I remember the first time I experienced that, it really drew me back. I was like, oh, like that's the tension I've been feeling. Is like, I know what's going on. Like, I know the liturgy, but these aren't my people. It's very hard for me to describe exactly that sensation, but not sure if you've had that experience or
not. It doesn't, like, I think I know what you're talking about for sure, in the sense that you might not be aiming at the same. I mean, you want to be careful in how you're talking about it, I suppose, or I would want to be careful in how I'm talking about it, because you're there to worship God, but definitely there are cultural differences and differences in how people are raised and what their goal is in gathering to worship God. Like, is it something that is meant to overflow to the community, or is it meant to be just sequestered? And so I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you have anything that you would want to talk about regarding architecture? I mean, you've mentioned onion domes in particular, but if there's anything else architecturally that you've noticed that changes. I mean, one thing that I've noticed at certain parishes, sometimes the iconostasis, or like the wall of icons at the front, will be more transparent, in the sense that you'll have icons that are suspended and you can see through to more of what's happening in the altar. And then you'll have other parishes where it is more of a literal wall, and it's just the little doors that open up and you kind of peek in and see a very little bit. And I think for North Americans, I know that when I brought my parents, who aren't, they're Christian, but they're not Orthodox Christian, when they've come to liturgy sometimes and there's been a parish that's more of a wall, sometimes their natural feeling is, well, why can't I see what's up there? Am I less significant because I'm back here and they're doing some secret things up there that are like really exciting and I'm kept out from that? So I think sometimes having a bit of a ability to view what's going on there, in the sense of having just like icons suspended, can help disabuse people of this notion that there's all this fancy stuff going on in the altar. It's very important what's going on there, but I think sometimes people have false notions of what is occurring behind the icon screen.
I think in some cultures, and especially the cultures where Orthodoxy developed its liturgical traditions, in some cultures, if something's precious, you cover it. If something's precious, you veil that thing. And it's culturally understood what's happening there. So you wouldn't have that feeling, right? It's hidden, right? Which means it's sacred, it's holy, it's over there. But in some cultures, if something's precious, you unveil it, you reveal it. And I think we live in a culture in North America, in the West, where we value things like transparency, right? And egalitarianism, right? We have these like cultural
norms,
customs, So when we are suspicious of things being covered up, right? So for us, that icon wall, I think, is a great example of that tension, right? Because if you're inheriting the Orthodox tradition, it says we need to veil things because they're sacred. But how do you express that in a North American context, which has the cultural assumption that if you veil something, it means you're hiding it and you're being secretive in a deceptive way? It's like, well, there's a fine line to be had there, right? And of course, the community that I go to, we're currently, there's negotiation over we're literally having this discussion, right? Because we don't have an iconostas. We've got two stands with some icons on them, but we don't have an iconostas. So how are we talking about this? And one of the things that I express is that wall has a liturgical purpose and a symbolic purpose. It shows you something, right? And the thing it actually shows you is that it is open. But the only way you can really appreciate the fact that it's open is if you can close it. Because if it's always open, then there's no understanding of it being open. It's just neutral, right?
Yeah.
So you need to have something that blocks and closes so that you can, at the beginning of a service, you open the curtain, which is a very profound gospel image, right? The veil of the temple is torn in two. There is nothing holding back the connection of heaven and earth. Nothing. That's the point of the wall. It's not to say actually heaven is over here and you're not allowed. It's actually literally the opposite. So once you understand what is trying to be conveyed in the physical architecture of the space, then from there, I think you can start figuring out what are ways that we can express that in a way that makes sense to the North American mind without drawing attention to the fact that it's up there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I think that's a key point that you just made, in the sense that the way that you appropriate the tradition of Orthodoxy is by being immersed in it and seeing what the actual point of it is. And then once you grasp that, as much as that's possible, then trying
Don't move
to...
the mocha. Don't move the mocha.
Exactly. And then trying to see how that can connect effectively with people in North America. And one other thing that I want to mention is just how you have people that are coming in and you want them to be sort of stunned by the liturgy, as it were, that they don't understand what's going on completely, that it's not just stooping to their level entirely. They're not being handed a warm coffee with a rock band up on the stage to make fun of some other beloved brothers and sisters in Christ. But it's not that, but at the same time, it's something that is connecting with them deeply, and it's showing them who they could be. And so this seems very fitting in the sense that within Orthodoxy, it is meant to perpetuate the revelation of Jesus Christ, that God became a man. And so this seems to be both those aspects, that on one hand, it is divinity, it is overwhelming. You have Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration that is just too much for anyone to handle. But at the same time, he is fully divine and reveals himself through his death and resurrection and shows us who we could be. And so there is an aspect in which, well, our purpose as people is found in Christ, and he is what it means to be a human being. And so when people see Christ, they at once realize that he is completely different because he is divine by nature. And at the same time, he's who I could be. And I've always known this because that telos is baked into me, like that purpose is baked into me as a person, but I've forgotten who I'm supposed to be. I've become blind. I am the person that needs to be healed and rehabilitated by Christ and drawn up. And these are actually what all the miracles of Christ are about. They're about restoring our spiritual perception so that we can see things accurately. They're all little hints at the resurrection, if you notice them. It's like people laying down, being brought up, people that are blind that can now suddenly see. It's like waking up, being able to act. And so this seems really fitting with what Orthodox liturgy and the tradition is meant to do, show us what we could be, but in a way that we never imagined.
Yeah. And I want to bring up this point again, because I think this will be the third time that we bring it up, and maybe that's a good sort of structure here. But we will make mistakes. Like, we will make mistakes. You better believe that there's plenty of icons that the Slavic Christians started painting and just did not stand the test of time, did not get ingrained into the community life of the church, and they ended up rotting away and they're gone, right? And there's going to be music compositions that aren't going to connect with people and they'll go away. But that doesn't, we cannot be scared away from the fact that we are being asked to grow the church, right? We are being asked to invest and to risk, in a sense, the church. And we have to have a degree of bravery as Orthodox Christians and a degree of forgiveness. We will make mistakes, right? Individuals within the church and even church communities and stuff will make mistakes, but to be compassionate and forgiving. And I think having those two things, being willing to See, when I say the phrase being willing to take the risk, I can just see how many alarm bells would go off in people's heads, right? But I think there's a degree to which that's true. You got to be willing to take the risk, or at least be willing to be brave, but also be forgiving as well. And just like, Christ has overcome the world. It's okay. Remain within the hierarchical structure of the church. Be obedient to your priest, and have fun. It's joy to be in the church.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think that's a helpful point, that this is the way things have always been done, because people aren't perfect, surprise, and they don't have a clear read on themselves. We aren't transparent to ourselves. The future is not transparent to us. We don't see things perfectly accurately. And so the inevitable course of events is that, try as we may to not make mistakes, we are going to, and that we can see this throughout the life of the church, where we could go down this list of like saints, like people that were included for a time. This doesn't happen very often, but people that were included for a time that died in good standing. I'm thinking of Origen of Alexandria, who later was like, well, maybe not. We'll sort of bar that way for a bit, because there's some sketchy stuff down there, which there is, as well as some beautiful stuff. Music that comes and goes depending on the maintenance of it. I think that's one way to put it. And then the styles of icons, as you mentioned, that would be endorsed at certain times. There were times where you would have depictions of God the Father that sort of crop up, and that these aren't a good way to go, because God the Father does not, like, Jesus Christ is the image of God the Father. There's not a separate image of God the Father. So let's not depict God the Father. So like this happened, and it was an aberration, I would argue, from Orthodox tradition, and it came and went, and hopefully that's behind us for the most part. And then architecture as well. Like, Christians have met in all sorts of buildings. They've met in catacombs. They've met in more like Roman Senate houses, or like these long sort of tunnel-like buildings. And the cross in the square church sort of evolved. And so there's been lots of different attempts to develop something architecturally that fits, and things have come and gone. And so the only thing I'd want to mention here is, it sounds, Father Yuri, like you're calling people to be somewhat entrepreneurial, and to trust that, to kind of set aside the perfectionist tendency, that perfectionists want to be great, and they think that the only way to do that is by not making mistakes, when in reality, the only way to be great is to make mistakes, because we have a limited view on things, and we have to experiment and try things and see them fail, and just keep moving forward. And ultimately, to perhaps, maybe this is another part of the call that you're encouraging people towards, is to be an actor, not to just be an observer, not to just sit passively by and criticize what other people may or may not be doing, but to be involved in your parish, and to say what may be effective, and to just be pushing forward in this way, in a positive manner, rather than just maybe criticizing and throwing tomatoes at people.
Yeah, one thing that I've learned in my community when it comes to, because as a pastor, as a priest of a church, you're making decisions about the worshiping life of the community and stuff. You make decisions about icons, about the carpet, right? Like you make those decisions. You really have to get a deep understanding of what the community wants. So listen to the community, right? If you're in the hierarchy, get the voices from lower down on the hierarchy, so to speak. Get those voices. You need to understand what it is, and you need to put aside your own thing. So I might come to my church with a desire like, oh, I want to do this hymn antiphonally like they did in the early church, or something like that, right? And I might have these ideas about what liturgy should be. Or like, well, this is what they did in the ancient times, so therefore we should do it now. That's not a good enough reason to do it. But if I don't ask the community, well, what do you think? I'm thinking about doing this, right? Maybe getting the bishop's take on it, maybe a couple of fellow priests. If you are not willing to maybe ask your bishop and get a blessing, or at least talk to several other priests and get their take, and to actually listen to what they have to say, then maybe that's a guardrail against making a decision about how we're going to change something within the life of the church, or change the expression of a certain psalm within the liturgy. So that's kind of one thing. That's from the hierarchical side, the church side, the clergy side. But from the lay side, it's again also letting your voice be heard, right? In a way that's humble, and in a way that you are willing to accept if the priest goes in a different direction. So if you say, I would like this, I would like to commission this icon in this style, what do you think? He goes, no. Then you have to be humble and say, thank you for the feedback. Would you be okay if I maybe found another iconographer and whatever? And you might say, sure. So you have to be, there has to be kind of this mutual humility, and you have to genuinely be open to listening to the other and getting those voices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to try to summarize some of the ground that we've covered, and then if you want to send us away with a final thought. But Father Yuri and I have been talking about Orthodox tradition and how to practice that in a North American way, a way that on one hand isn't just wooden, just not copy and pasting exactly what's been done before, because this seems similar to the parable of the man with the talent who just buried it in the ground, didn't change it, didn't take a risk, and played it safe and was condemned at the end of time. So hopefully we're not in that category, but also we're not talking about doing the opposite extreme of just going to people and saying, well, what do you want? Who have no idea what the church is about and no idea of what we're doing there, and then just doing exactly what the world already does, but in a worse way. So instead, to have a deep appreciation of the purpose of Orthodox tradition, that it is to connect us with Christ, and to then ask the question, how can we help people in this place, in this time, connect with Christ? Because the church does not exist for itself, exists for the life of the world, and that we have a responsibility as Christians, not only to be growing in our own walk with Christ, but to extend this to other people and at once show them by God's grace what is truly divine and totally different than they may have ever anticipated or expected in a church, but at the same time totally fitting and natural for who they should be, because Christ is what it means to be a human person, and in him we find who we are meant to be. And so this pertains to the saints that are commemorated in a church. There might be certain ones that we are emphasizing more than others. This pertains to the style of music that we are employing in a church that fits the English language. This applies to the icons that are used, not only of the individual saints that are depicted in these icons, but actually the style of the iconography, whether it's more vibrant in color, maybe it's less dour in expression. There's other little modifications that can be made that are totally fitting and appropriate, as well as the architecture that we're using and worshiping within. What communicates, again, the sense of transcendence, that it is beyond us, it is something completely different, but at the same time, something that's so fitting that people feel like this is the place that I've always meant to be worshiping in. It doesn't feel unnatural in that sense. And this is what has always been going on in the sense of adapting Orthodoxy to different cultures, that whether you go to Greece or Russia or Antioch or wherever else, there are different expressions of Orthodoxy. So we're not talking in this conversation about doing something completely different. We're actually trying to embody Orthodoxy as it's already being embodied, or we're trying to apply it in the same spirit as it's been applied in the past.
That's perfect. I can't do anything better than that.
Well, final thought then. Final thought.
Be brave. Be brave. That's all.
Well, thank you so much, Father Yuri, for another excellent conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Always fun talking to you.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out that episode of the Orthodox Christian Podcast. If you have a question about Orthodox Christianity, there is a link in the episode description that you can check out. There's a second link to Saint Maria of Paris Orthodox Mission in Hamilton. It's quite a mouthful, but if you want to say hi to Father Yuri and see how they are embodying the Orthodox tradition in a North American way, I would encourage you to check out a liturgy there. If you enjoyed this episode, I would appreciate it if you shared it with one friend or family member. And in the meantime, I hope that you have a peaceful week. Take care.